Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. And good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this very special session by India Deep Tech on AI. Right, we're super excited to be hosting this. I'm your host, Arjun Rao, for the event today. Uh, we have an hours program set today to to discuss AI first companies in India and learn about AI in general, right, from some very eminent speakers and experts in the domain, right? So super excited to be part of this and to be hosting this. I'll begin by introducing uh, India Deep Tech, which is today's host and organizing today's event. India Deep Tech is a industry-wide alliance based of comprising of entrepreneurs, corporates, incubators, and venture capitalists, bringing together an ecosystem that can really help deep tech startups in India to succeed. Right? We're super excited that this particular last few years and the next decade is going to be super exciting for deep tech, and hence this alliance has come together. Right? The objective is to create a vibrant community to exchange ideas and learnings and to help and promote deep tech startups coming out of the Indian ecosystem that are building products and companies for the global markets as well. Right? Over the last 6 months, India Deep Tech has done sessions on space tech, genomics already, right, where some eminent speakers and exciting entrepreneurs have spoken and shared their thoughts. Today, session on focused on AI. This is a little bit about India Deep Tech. If you need to know more information, please go to the link indiadeeptech.com and you will find a lot more information, right? And we will share that with everybody as well. One of the initiatives that India Deep Tech is also focusing on to foster the ecosystem and to help enable deep tech startups to succeed is an accelerator program that is coming up very soon. The industry-wide 6-week acceleration program for deep tech startups. We have that is being put together by all the volunteers and all the team members for India Deep Tech as we speak. There's an application deadline that will be set aside, right, for February 12th, where early stage startups can apply and will get evaluated and will get selected for this 6-week acceleration program, right? So we're really calling on all deep tech startups to apply to this India Deep Tech Accelerator program. And once again, just to repeat, February 12th is the application deadline for the same, right? There's a slide here that you can take a look at, and we'll also be posting this on various social media platforms for all deep tech startups to apply. Right, so that's a little background about India Deep Tech and Accelerator. Quick 1 minute about myself and how one of the founding partners at Special Invest that I represent. We're a pre-seed seed fund focused on early stage deep tech ideas. We invest up to $500,000 in software, enterprise software, as well as enterprise and industrial hardware companies focused on AI, machine learning, computer vision, space technology, robotics, and other cutting edge domains in the deep tech space. Right, so I'm super excited to host this event today, and with not further delaying things, I would love to introduce our keynote speaker, introduce Dr. Vinay, who's one of the foremost AI experts in India. He's currently the co-founder of Ati Motors, which is a startup making autonomous vehicles for the world. Dr. Vinay is a professor at IISc for over a decade, where he co-invented Seputer, that a lot of us may have heard of, India's first handheld computer. Right? He's also co-founded one of India's earliest and top life sciences startup, Strand Life Sciences. A lot of you may have heard of that as well, right? He has a wide range of interests and expertise, mathematical aspects of computer science, especially in complexity theory, algorithms, and data mining, right? Very, very excited to have Dr. Vinay amongst us to speak about AI and the evolution and his thoughts on that space over the next few minutes. Post which we will have a panel discussion that we will further into. Dr. Vinay, over to you.
Thanks, Arjun. Let me share my screen. Am I visible?
Yes,
Yes.
Dr. Vinay.
Okay, so let me get started. So I have roughly about 12 to 15 minutes, and I want to give you a quick overview of AI, and also from a historical perspective to just for us to understand how this area started and how it has evolved over time. I'm going to start from the very beginning in some sense, looking at ancient approaches to knowledge. And as you know, different civilizations have different approaches to accumulating or assimilating knowledge. And in maybe 2000 years back, there was one civilization which actually thought that knowledge should be accumulated in a deductive fashion, which means that you have to infer things and so on. And this school was championed by the Greeks. This is essentially geometry. All of us will remember that I think geometry is sort of introduced, Euclidean geometry is introduced around 7th or 8th standard to most children. And that is when we first confront theorems and lemmas and so on. And until then, most of us would have done some arithmetic of various sorts, which is basically computational. Okay? So the Greeks championed this whole idea of geometry. And in contrast, the Indians were looking at algebra. It was calculational. It is not that Indians did not do geometry. There are many Indians who did do geometry, but primarily Indians as a civilization has been an algebraic civilization. It has been a linguistic, verbal, algebraic civilization of sorts. So what that means is that the way people thought about problems were very different. So the Greeks were model builders. What it means is that they used geometry and they would build models and they would infer things from these models. And based on this inference, they would understand things around them, the universe, whatever they wanted to understand. The Indians on the other side is what Professor Rodam Narasimha, who recently passed away, used to call as computational positivists. We believed in not building models because somehow models were not appealing for Indians, but we wanted to build computational tools which could actually explain phenomena. And the word that was used by Indians very heavily, and even today it is used, is a word from Sanskrit, but also I think if many of you know Kannada, you will also know this. It's called prayojana. What is the use? Okay? And anything that did not have use was not interesting for the Indians. And that's true even today. Even today, I think there are many things that we think, I mean, it could be Bitcoin, it could be a painting of Van Gogh. But no Indian is going to put 50 million and buy a painting of Van Gogh because the question is going to be, what is the use? Right? So that is somehow culturally inherent in us. So as an example of model building, the example that I want to give is about from astronomy. This is about Ptolemy, who came up with this notion of epicycles. It's a geometric construct. And he used this to explain how actually planets went around each other. Okay, at that point in time, Ptolemy probably didn't know that the sun was at the center, but the idea was to be able to reconcile the observations of planetary motion with a theory. So they built a model called epicycles, and that's what Ptolemy did. It was a fairly good. The theory and the practice agreed a fair bit, okay, in what Ptolemy did. But we know that the fact that it agrees does not mean that it is correct. Okay? The Indians, on the other hand, did something vastly different. Aryabhatta, in a few sutras or shlokas, just gave some formulas to compute, algebraic formulas, and said, if you want to know when the eclipse of the moon is, do A, B, C, and D, and then you calculate something, and that will tell you what it is. No explanations. There was no hint of where these formulas came from. It was just a procedure laid out, and you just had to follow these procedures. So this was the stark difference in approach between two different great civilizations of the past. Models dictate outputs in the Greek model, and models can be wrong. As I said, the epicycle model is wrong. Now we know that planets go around the sun. We know that it follows a path of a near circle, but not quite a circle. It is an eclipse. It's an ellipse. And in the case of the Indians, all they had to do was to find some calculations that matched the observation. Okay. This was the state of science until about 350, 400 years back. And then something very interesting and dramatic happened. The birth of modern science, in some sense, was the fact that these two ideas merged. And the merger, okay, so before that, I just wanted to say that there was one more person in between called Parameshwara. He belonged to the Kerala School of Mathematics around 1400s. And he defined something called Dig Ganita. Dig is to see and Ganita is to compute. And his entire philosophy was to say that what you compute should agree with what you observe. And you want to minimize the error between these two things. And Parameshwar actually spent a lot of time. He spent about 55 years and looked at eclipses of various sorts. And eventually, all he did was to correct some parameters that Aryabhatta had given up roughly about 1,000 years back. And because there was now 1,000 years in between, things had changed. The eclipses were not occurring at the time that Aryabhatta had predicted for a variety of reasons. And what Parameshwara did was to fine-tune those parameters to make sure that it agrees better. Okay? So Dig Ganita, therefore, is in some sense the basis of C and compute. And I'll later tell you, and probably you would already guessed it, that much of deep learning that we know today is precisely follows this particular model of C and compute. Okay, these two strands merged in 1687, and probably all of you know what happened in 1687. Newton wrote his famous book, De Principia. And in the first two volumes of the book, he actually gave the three laws of motion. And these were completely geometric. So it was in the spirit of the Greeks. And in the last volume, he had to reconcile the observation that Kepler had made. And the way he reconciled it was to invent a formula. This was a computational formula. It did not come from the three laws of motion. And that was the universal law of gravitation, which we all learned again. That's just a product of the mass and inversely proportional to the square of the distance. Okay. That formula, which we now take for granted, actually is a computational formula. It has no, technically, it has no physical basis per se. Okay. It agrees with what we observe. And Newton actually was apparently he was not sure how to introduce it. And because it was not deducible. And this is one of the interesting cases where these two strands met. And Narasimha has several papers where he talks about why did this merger of these two strands happen in Europe. It could have happened in China, it could have happened in India, but for some reason it happened in Europe. Okay? And it may have been a historical accident, but that's what happened at that point in time. Modern AI started in 1956. Lots of well-known names like McCarthy, Turing, Shannon, Minsky, Simon, okay, all of them. The emphasis initially, especially for the first 25, 30 years, was on symbolic AI, which was logical reasoning and deduction. By mid-40s, we already had a notion of an artificial neuron. And around 58, 59, Rosenblatt actually had the perceptron learning rule. So we knew how to train the first perceptron, so to speak. And around that time, early 60s, I think natural language processing also took off. So all of these things happened around within the mid 50s and the mid 60s. Deep learning, on the other hand, which had a lot of start and stops over the last 40, 50 years. Initially, as neural network, as I said, it started in the late 40s with the definition of an artificial neuron. And then in the 60s, what happened was that Minsky and Papert wrote an influential book, which said that you can't do much with perceptrons. So it took a back seat, got revived in the mid 80s by Hopfield. And things happened for about 10 years then. And then again, it took a back seat for another 10 years and got revived around about 15 years back, 2005, 6. And it has been spectacular over the last 10 years. And what is deep learning? Essentially, it says, if you have data, we will build a complicated algebraic expression to learn the input-output relationship. So effectively, this is just, in some sense, what Parmeshwara would have approved in some sense, that you see data, you know what the input is, you know what the output is, and what you want to do is to figure out a complex algebraic expression which will actually do this mapping. So the tension in, so before I get there, so where has deep learning been effective? Deep learning has been effective in places where we actually thought we didn't know how to do things well. Cognition was our problem. Language, speech, vision. In the mid-90s, I used to be part of the Center for AI and Robotics. And it's one of the few AI places in India at that point in time. Probably there were, I don't know, maybe 20, 30 people working in AI in India at that point. The problems were that we didn't know how natural language processing, people used to use some statistical methods and so on and so forth. Speech was very difficult. We used to use hidden Markov models. Computer vision was completely classical at that point in time. Okay? So we're going to break through. All of this has happened in the last decade or so. Okay? The tension is that there is still the Greeks and the Indians in this particular area. Symbolic AI has taken a back seat for the last 10 years. All major advances have happened because of deep learning. The 1687 moment does not happen. And when that happens, you will probably get true AI in some sense, which will reconcile symbolic AI, deductibility, and computation. Both of these have to get married at some stage, but that hasn't, maybe it'll happen. It's probably waiting for some Newton to come along and do something like that. I wanted to show you a typical AI book. This is a 2020 book. I mean, it's been there for a long time, Russell and Norvig. But I wanted to understand that if you look at the first several chapters, you're looking at first order logic, you're looking at probabilistic reasoning, how do you make complex decisions, and so on and so forth. Problem solving of various sorts, how do you search, constraint satisfaction problems. Machine learning is there, chapter 5, and that's a small part of things. Okay? It's one of the chapters. And within machine learning, we have deep learning and reinforcement learning, which is a subset of that. Okay? But that is what, in some sense, is ruling today. Okay? So what is deep learning essentially? So we require data, we require parameters and connections which make up the architecture of the network that we want to build. And we require a fair amount of compute power. And the 30 years that has, I can say that I was working on neural networks in 1995. I was working on something called Hopfield networks at that point in time. The difference between 1995 and 2021 is the exponential growth in all of these things. There's enormous amount of data, the number of parameters and connections that we look at today as compared to what we were doing in 1995 is enormous. The computing power that we have today is enormous. So all of these have gone out in exponential magnitudes. Okay? And that is essentially the difference. There have been some breakthroughs in terms of engineering, in terms of how we can train these networks. But in a sense, if computing was available at that point in time, these things may have happened 20, 30 years earlier. Okay? There was no, I think the primary breakthrough has been computing. It's not so much the engineering ideas, which I think would have come if the computing was there. So to contrast, Parameshwara, when he changed what Aryabhatta did, had probably something like 6 parameters. GPT-3, which is a natural processing model or algorithm in 2020, April or May of 2020, which came from the OpenAI group, has about 175 billion parameters. And to just understand the connection in the human brain, we are at 100 trillion. So humans are still ahead of the game, and we will be ahead of the game for some, for some time, maybe. And I don't want to speculate whether the next 20 years, 30 years, or 50 years, but we will still be ahead. We're still useful for the machines. And instead of trying to see or make sure that everything is good, I want to say that not everything is very good. The main problem, as I said, is that this is a very computational approach, deep learning. So there's no explainability. It's very nascent, very narrow, very fragile. It has no sense of understanding. It has a lot of biases, and algorithmic fairness is a growing area now, research area, where you want to know how do you remove biases from in the training process that we undertake. Needs way too many examples even compared to a 3-year-old child. You can show a cat to a 3-year-old child, and maybe a child will spend about 2 minutes looking at a cat and probably knows all the cats in the world. Okay, but unless I give some 20,000 samples of cats and dogs or something, no network can recognize or differentiate them. Okay. And the fact that we live in an era where all governments have decided that all the public streets should be full of cameras and so on, means that people want to figure out how to protect privacy. There's an article from Nature that came. Okay, so this is a very simple mask that somebody is wearing, and the mask is enough to fool. It can't fool any child that it's a human, and can recognize who the human is. But this is adequate to fool a deep network. Okay, the same thing that on the right you see a privacy visor. This is a Japanese invention, and so people wear these things. You can buy this off Amazon and so on. You can wear these things, and hopefully you're protected. Hopefully you cannot be identified, especially if you went to Capitol Hill a few weeks back or something of that sort, or maybe even to Delhi a few days back, you would probably be protected. So Nature carried an article sometime back, 2019, on why deep learning AIs are so easy to fool. And here are some simple examples of fooling. Okay, there's a stop sign, and some stickers have been stuck on it. And these stickers are enough to make the neural network think that the stop sign is actually a speed limit. And it also thinks the speed limit is 45. So now you can see why this sort of thing can be very dangerous for an autonomous vehicle. A public autonomy, especially, if all you have to do is to stick some stickers on a stop sign, and probably it will think that, well, I can go at up to 45 kilometers an hour, or maybe if it's this in the US, you can think it's 45 miles per hour, you are in real trouble. Okay? And in similar spirit, you can add some fairly random noise, and you can, panda can become something else, a sloth can become a racing car, but just adding certain very specific types of noise. So deep networks are fairly fragile in their construction. And we should be aware that it is fragile. You have a computing formula to do things, but they are not robust. The other problem that we need to bother about is that engineers today have to take decisions, ethical decisions, okay, on things that philosophers have been debating for maybe 2000 years. There's a famous trolley problem, all of you would be aware of it. But how does a vehicle decide what to take? It has to take a decision. And the problem is that once a vehicle decides to take a decision, it will consistently take that decision forever, right? And so who is this engineer who decides what is the right thing to be done, right? So it means that we need to train our engineers into taking courses in philosophy, taking courses in ethics, and so on. Okay. One other question that we were asked is, where is India? India is doing okay. We probably don't have too many students at this point, maybe about 50, 60, maybe 100 PhD students across the IITs and IISc. We probably have about 50, 60 faculty members across the major institutes in India. IISc has among the largest faculty in AI, probably about a dozen. But I think the main problems of India are the same that academia faces, companies face. Okay, so where is data? Okay, so I was doing something on COVID, collaborated with some people at IISc, wrote a paper and so on, but data has been very difficult to get, even from India. Okay, the government is unwilling to share data, and it's very difficult to get any sort of data that we want. Okay, where is infra that we require to do our training, and where is the resource for all these, a variety of things we need to do. I just want to end with a simple comparison slide as to, overall, the one thing that we understand is money. And in terms of money, I just want to tell where we are. IISc, which is the premier research institute in India, #1 for the last 3-4 years in the Ministry of Education ranking and so on, has a budget, union budget of 78 million. Okay, this is about roughly 550 crores. Okay, and on its own, it raises another $75 million or so from DST and various other places. And so overall, it has a budget of $150 million overall. But the union government pays about $80 million. Stanford has a budget of 6.8 billion, annual budget of 6.8 billion. And DeepMind, which is one of the big AI companies that many of you would be familiar with, annually, only its salaries, I'm not talking about its resources in terms of its total spend, its salary bill this year was 650 million. Okay. And remember that the 12 people I spoke about at IISc who do machine learning is part of the 500 faculty members who are all in that $78 million budget. And now you can ask, it's very easy to ask, where is India? Why are we not doing well? We are a population of 1 billion people and so on. The problem, whether it is IISc or the problem, whether it is companies like us, is the same. Who is willing to put a bet on us? Okay. And I'm bringing this explicitly because hopefully there are a lot of VCs listening to us. And hopefully somebody will sit up and say, okay, there's something that we need to do. So I want to draw a comparison. I think we are like the cricket team of the 80s and 90s. 80s and 90s, the Indian cricket board was not the richest board. Okay, it was an okay board. We had talent. We had a Gavaskar somewhere, we had a Kapil Dev somewhere, but we would win a few test series within the country, would go out and get knocked out properly. There was no Mohammad Siraj or Washington Sundar of those times who would come and save us. We didn't have any of that. Okay, but today we have, and part of the reason we have that is because today the cricket board is one of the richest, and we have IPL, and players have the exposure and they have the confidence. So as entrepreneurs in the AI space, we need to travel. We need to traverse somehow from the 80s, 90s to 2020. And this logjam has to be broken. And that requires us to become confident about what we do. And for that, we have to spend money and we have to fail. If you're afraid of failing, we're not going to come out of this. We have to be, we probably require 100 companies to come. Maybe 1 or 2 will succeed, but 98 may fail. But that is what we require to make sure that we have the team that Rahane has in 2020. Okay. So thank you. Let me stop here. And if there are any questions, I'm willing to take it maybe at the end. I don't know. I think Kiran can decide that. Kiran?
Yeah, at the end will be good. Arjun, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Vinay. That was very, very insightful, for you to take us through that background and the history and connect it to where we are today. Amazing learning, and also with a view forward of what is required for us to, leap forward into the future, right? Particularly with AI in India. Thank you very much, right?
Thank you.
We will go on to, leading this to a very exciting panel discussion, right, of AI startups across India and that are building some very exciting products. And this will be hosted and moderated by Kiran Mysore. A little background about Kiran. Kiran is a principal at UTech, a Japanese deep tech fund. He leads their global AI investments and has led about $30 million in investments in AI startups across India, Singapore, and the US, right? He's ideally placed to be in this position because his background is in AI research and also as a social entrepreneur before he's turned a venture capitalist, right? So over to Kiran to run this exciting panel discussion. Kiran, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think, we were very amazed with Dr. Vinay's presentation. Thanks for the kind introduction, Arjun. As Arjun said, I'm currently a principal at UTech Japan. We are a $550 million fund investing in global deep science and technology companies. We've done over 100 investments in the last 14 years, and we've generated 13 IPOs and 12 M&As. We started investing in India in deep tech startups about 2.5 years back. And we've already invested over $25 million in 4 Indian deep tech companies. 2 of them are actually panelists here as well. I am currently joining from Tokyo in Japan. So we have 4 fantastic panelists here. So why don't I quickly kind of intro and we can get to it. So first we have Abhimanyu, who is the CEO of Agara. So Abhimanyu comes with 14 years of operating experience in startups and investment banking. He has held stints with startups such as Stazilla and investment banks such as Mape Advisory and Rabobank. He's also an alumnus of IIM Calcutta. Abhimanyu, why don't you take a minute or two to tell us what you're doing at Agara Labs? It's an enterprise voice AI company. Please do tell us about Agara and how you're using AI at Agara.
Sure.
Go ahead.
Sure. Thanks, Kiran. And thanks, Dr. Vinay, for that fantastic talk. Some of the things that you mentioned is something that we live through almost every day. We are operating in the space of automating voice conversations. That's our primary objective. Sort of narrowing it down to the business to consumer space. And so if you've ever picked up the phone and called up your customer support desk at your phone at your telecom company, or you've walked into a utility company to pay your bill and waited for 20 minutes before somebody came up and so on, that's exactly the problem we are trying to solve. Can we get machines to come and talk to you the way you would expect a person to, and hopefully not have to go through the same kind of inefficiencies or wait times, frustrations, frankly, that exist in that system the way it is today globally. And using this automation of voice in a natural form enable all kinds of scenarios where today gaps exist by essentially putting machines in place to improve.
Got it. Thank you very much, Abhimanyu. Up next, we have Dr. Geeta Manjunath, who is the CEO and founder of Niramay Health. Geeta is an industry expert herself. She has over 25 years experience in AI and R&D. Geeta has held senior positions in Xerox, HP, and CDAC. She also holds a PhD from IISc and a management degree from Kellogg School. Geeta, why don't you please take a minute to explain what you're building at Niramai and how you're using AI to do so. Over to you.
Sure. Thanks, Kiran. And again, amazing insights, Dr. Vinay. Super. So hi all. Uh, at Niramai, we are developing a new way of detecting breast cancer, which is one of the largest women issues today, which is taking away 650,000 lives every year. It's kind of, this is every year, not just 2020 and we're fighting corona and all, right? And the key problem is multiple with the current methods. There is no test for detecting breast cancer in women under 45 years of age, and even if there is a beautiful test called mammography, it is actually radiation based, X-ray based, so you cannot do the test very often, and so on and so forth. So what we have done is to use sort of the age-old sensing method of detecting heat distribution on the skin, and have developed computer vision / AI algorithms to basically say whether something is wrong with the person, so that she can go for a follow-up, a diagnostic test. So the aim is to enable early detection of breast cancer in a way that it can be operated by simple health workers. So you can have multiple people, or almost every lady on earth can actually take the test. So we made it affordable, accessible, automated, and all of those through AI-based challenges, which I would love to talk about throughout the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Geeta. Up next is Dr. Vinay. While you already know his introduction, currently actually he's working, he's a co-founder of an interesting autonomous startup called Ati Motors. Over to Dr. Vinay to describe what you're doing at Ati Motors in a minute or two. Go ahead, please.
So I think in Ati Motors, what we want to do is we want to look at autonomous vehicles, but in within factories, in industrial areas, within factories, private campuses, and so on. Part of the reason we decided to do that was because we said we didn't want to get into a lot of regulation and into ethical problems that I described in my talk. And so we said that if we do not have a driver on the vehicle, at least the vehicle itself has value, but it can be something that can be destroyed. So we said, okay, it's perfectly all right to have an autonomous vehicle that is driverless. Okay, so that's essentially what we do, and most of our customers are factories and currently they're all in India. And the main reason for buying us is not just as labor replacement. It's mostly, surprisingly, because they want to become more productive and they want to reduce variability. And those are reasons why many of them come to us. Though it initially looks like labor is what they want to replace, but there are some enlightened factories which today say that we do not want our employees to be pushing 500 kgs of weight. We would rather have a autonomous vehicle doing it, but that doesn't mean that they want to replace that person. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, got it. Thanks a lot, Dr. Vinay. Very interesting application of AI to industrial tech. Next up, we have Dr. Zainul, who is the co-founder and CTO of Tricog Health. Zainul is an expert in embedded systems and machine learning. He has had stints with IBM and Qualcomm both in India and US, and he holds a PhD from UCLA and a bachelor's from IIT Bombay. Dr. Zainul, why don't you tell us about Tricog Health and your impact across the world? Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Kiran. So Tricog is an AI-powered cardiac diagnostics platform. What we do is we provide ECG and echocardiogram interpretations to our customers who are typically clinics, hospitals, and diagnostic labs. We currently operate in about 3,000 locations across across India, Southeast Asia, and Africa. And we also have operations in 8 other countries, including China as well.
Thank you very much for that, Dr. Sheth. So yeah, sorry, Dr. Zainul, I mispronounced the name of your co-founder. Actually, two of the companies here are UTech's portfolio as well, Agara and Tricog, and I've had the pleasure of working with others here as well, Dr. Geeta and Dr. Vinay. So why don't we get to some questions, perhaps for the next 15 minutes, and then would love to open up for Q&A from the audience. So first question is to Abhimanyu of Agara. So voice AI is a space where big tech, Abhimanyu, is fairly active. The Googles, the Amazons of the world, developing products and services as well. So from a product standpoint, how did you build a differentiated product at Agara? And what are the competitive advantages you see in building such a product? Go ahead, please.
Sure. So yeah, you're right. Big tech has a massive distinct advantage. I think Dr. Vinay outlined that very clearly, both in terms of data, resources, and simply the scope of work that they can target out. But I think one of the good things that has happened to us is we've been sort of able to turn our disadvantage into our USP. We're not looking to solve a problem as wide as a Google or an Amazon would do, or a DeepMind, for example. We're able to sort of narrow down the scope of operations for us. We look at very specific spaces within which we are looking at automation. So when you talk about business to consumer communication, it narrows down the scope of language itself to a very short set. In addition, we talk about GPT a lot, distinct jump forward in terms of language processing. But GPT is essentially trying to replicate all of human understanding, all of human language. We are not. We are trying to do language that happens in a very focused problem-solving kind of approach in a very narrow domain. Because we've narrowed down the domain dramatically, our overall data requirement to compete effectively in that space goes up dramatically. And so what we are able to do is, in that narrow sliver of operations where we are able to perform better than some of the other guys. Although if you look at it on a wider scale of things, we will not fall anywhere. The other thing that also happens is, because we have this very narrow scope, we are able to secure data where sometimes big tech fails. So for example, we get access to a lot of customer care calls, which contains a huge amount of personal information, things which are extremely sensitive. While big tech has a ton of resources, for them to get access to that kind of data is full of compliance issues and so on. We, however, have none of those. So within that space, what we are able to get is and we've done this with several Fortune 500 companies who have opened their doors to that kind of data for us, which they would never, ever do for some of the larger companies. So you put the two together, a narrow domain with the ability to secure data that a lot of people don't, and we suddenly get a bit of an upper hand in there.
I see. So instead of doing broad use cases, you went deep into a narrow use case and built up your, that's very nice. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. So my next question is to Dr. Geeta of Niramai. This is about lab to market, and Niramai is a perfect example of it, right? I mean, the current standard for breast cancer screening is mammogram, but you're obviously you use thermal imaging, which is a marked improvement over anything in the market. Can you talk us through your journey of taking that technology from the lab to a customer facing product, and how did you go about it, Dr. Geeta?
Sure. Yes, as you said, the first idea was to see whether we can use a different type of sensing, right? And I think as a healthcare problem, right, first thing we also have to make sure, and I guess it's true for any domain, is to say, I mean, it's the sort of the problem statement, how do I use thermal imaging for breast cancer, or can I use, the problem statement is same. And especially when it relates to human body and so on and so forth, you will have to find some evidences of that being seen, right? So basically, one is to sort of look at literature, and has anyone in the earlier times, used thermal imaging? Is there any signal of breast cancer at all in thermal imaging? So that is the first piece, right? The problem formulation angle. And we did find a lot of data. In fact, like Dr. Vinay was saying, way back, in BCs and all that, people have tried to put mud on their body, on the body of a person, wet mud, to see which part of the body dries up fast, which means that's sort of hotter and there's something wrong with it, right? So it goes back to that kind of a insight that, yes, where something is wrong, that part of the body heats up. And then that's sort of the base. I mean, of course, this is something I learned recently, but so the one is literature survey to say, yes, thermal sensing is, has shown some indications. And yes, people have used it to try and see and detect breast cancer. But the problem really was just when something is hard, it is not cancer. There can be several reasons, and you can't just screen 100 people and say 60 of them have cancer, because that's not sort of the ideal. It's like 1 in 25, so it's about less than 4%. So to do this, the next step was to say, okay, does AI really help? So we looked at the sort of the core problem that you could call as lab, where we of course collaborated with hospitals and diagnostic centers, because today, if you just Google, you will not get millions of thermal images that you can download with labels and start building models, right? You really have to create an infrastructure to actually collect that data. So we collaborated with hospitals and said, okay, you use mammography, sonomammography, and all of that. And so before you do that, can you do thermal imaging for us? And here is a system. We'll put it out there. And of course, we started with two patients' data to see really whether there's something in at least you can see and figure out, and then we will go to the next level. And anyway, so that was the initial collaboration with hospitals. We collected the data, and then obviously next step was to see how do we know if somebody's cancerous or not. And it was very strange that, I'll keep it short, but it was very strange that today, obviously there are no more, many doctors who can look at a thermal image and say, yes, it is cancer or not, because if it is there, because it's non-radiation, affordable, and all of the good stuff, it would be there in every hospital. So we do not have. The reason that we do not have is not just training of doctors, it's just very, very difficult to manually look at it and say whether somebody is cancerous or not. There are like 400,000 picture points with every color or heat map it is, right? So you have to look at multiple colors and so on and so forth. So that's why we used like off-channel data source for class labeling, basically making every person who's doing the standard of care look at the biopsy result and sort of label it and so on and so forth. So that was sort of the first step to get an AI model which kind of seems to work. And with a reasonable accuracy, obviously. And then the product part comes in. So once we were convinced that that is something we want to do, then you sort of put paraphernalia around it so that doctors can actually use and then give feedback on it, right? So that whole product piece. And then, of course, working with the doctor, having clinical trials to basically put a systematic evaluation in place so that we can prove to others, yes, it works. And I think one of the other things which right now, on a hindsight, it's like, I guess a smart decision we did was to say, okay, how fast can we actually go to market? For a health tech, it was a big deal. But so in that regard, we made two main decisions, and the entrepreneurs listening may want to consider something equivalent of that. One is, let's say we go into the market, as in like people actually start using and give feedback and all that. How do you ensure that the hospital which is giving this test does not go to jail? And similarly, the doctors. So the medical legal aspect of it. So we were lucky to find a very senior doctor in Bangalore, Dr. Ram Prakash sir, who actually was confident looking at thermal imaging and evaluating and giving this feedback. So we partnered with him to say, okay, you're going to look at the reports, you're also going to look at the image, and then you give your feedback, whether you agree with us or not, right? But you're going to put your signature and you're going to take the liability. So that was the first thing we did. And second is we said, okay, anyway, our AI is our main focus and strength. So let's not go build thermal cameras and so on and so forth. Of course, we could do that, but if they're out there, can we make it work with off the shelf and make sure that it is already a regulatory cleared device in terms of safety, efficacy. So these two things we did, and a lot more things. Maybe I'll pause here. And so that's sort of the first product.
Thanks for the insight. I think beginning from problem first, as you said, and also playing to your algorithmic strengths and developing the solution hand in hand with the doctors. By the way, an anecdote, I remember your first deployment in BMS College Hospital, which is my alum in India. So just a quite kind of good shout out. So I came and checked it out almost 3 years back.
Lovely partners. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My next question is to Professor Vinay. Aati is working on your approach to autonomous vehicles is a bit different, right? There is, of course, public autonomy, self-driving cars, but you're choosing material movement in an industry. How important it is, Dr. Vinay, for a startup to choose their first target application, and how did you go about doing that at Aati Motors?
Yeah, I think very important. Without knowing what you want to develop, the solutions that you build will not scale or work out. So one of the first things we did was we spent probably 2-3 months just figuring out all scenarios where autonomy could be used, and then figured out, we pruned it and said these are the things that we could try. You should remember that even when we started on 2017, 18, the Googles and Teslas of the world already existed, which means that we couldn't compete with them with their deep pockets and so on, right? So we had to choose a niche where they're unlikely to look at. And the niche that we chose was industrial automation, primarily because I think countries like India, whether it's India, the Far East, maybe even Europe and so on, face similar problems, face similar challenges. The old world, so to speak, faces similar challenges. So that was primarily the idea. And once we decided that we're going to build an autonomous vehicle which will operate in private spaces, some of these regulatory challenges went away. Okay. And once the regulatory challenges went away, then the question was, we didn't want a driver. So one of the early decisions we set was, do we take a vehicle and then do we reverse engineer a vehicle to fit an autonomy stack on it? Or do I actually build the vehicle ground up? And we said we will build the vehicle ground up because the assumptions that somebody makes a Matador, for example, or a Tata Ace is very different from the assumptions that you make when you say that you don't require a driver sitting there. For example, first of all, ergonomics goes out of the window. Vehicles don't have to be that large. They can be very small and so on. So that was one of the first decisions that we took. The second decision that we had to take is, are we a robotics company or are we an automobile company? So robotics, as you know, is quote unquote expensive in terms of the robotic parts, whether it is the wheels, the chassis, they're built to a different type of customer for a different scale and so on. We wanted to take advantage of the fact that we wanted to be like an automobile startup, and therefore the scales that come with using a tire that goes onto a Bajaj Auto or a Maruti car is something that we could use, right? So, yeah, so I think knowing where your business is will help you decide what you finally build. And so it's extremely important.
I think all the three startups that we have talked till now, these are AI first companies, right? Did not just build something and sprinkle AI on top of it, but could not have existed without AI, so to speak. I think that's a great insight, Dr. Vinay. Thank you very much. And my next question is to Zainul of Tricog. So this is maybe one of a key question in that deep tech startups often have the capital barrier, right? Building an initial product may require upfront capital investment. On top of that, Tricog has components of hardware, algorithm, as well as data. And on top of that, you are in the healthcare space, which is generally considered tough. You've already raised Series B funding and you are in that way scaled up. How did you tackle the capital? How did you do your initial fundraising? And how did you iterate your product over time in a capital efficient manner, as I know?
Thanks, Kiran. I think so. There's been an interesting journey. It's been 6 years. I think one of the things that is very important to talk about is, when I think of deep tech, I really try to label it as hard tech. Tech that is hard to create and hard to replicate, and that hardness or difficulty is really what gives you that deep and wide moat, and that gives you that edge over competition. And so in terms of resources, capital is just one resource, but we have two more, which is one is data, especially for AI, and the other is time, because you have to let things iterate and go through that process to actually build something that is robust. And the trick that we applied early on is to get to market early and to validate product market fit as early as we could, even with you could arguably say with an unfinished product. And that kept us very focused on customer requirements. And so that also kept us honest, because we really spent our R&D dollars where the customers really wanted them. And that allowed us to improve the product continuously, giving new customers an even more differentiated product. and as existing customers, get an ever improving product, right? So, just making sure that we are getting to market, focusing on customer feedback, that customer centricity has really allowed us to be, putting our dollars really in the places, especially R&D dollars, in the places that really matter to customers. And I think we've done a fairly good job at that, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think figuring out the fastest and probably the least expensive path to the market is very interesting, and customer centricity. Very good insights, Dr. Zainul. And perhaps I'll do a quick second round of questions, and then we can get to some of the questions that our audience are asking as well. This question is to Abhimanyu of Agara about go-to-market. It's an important element for deep tech companies, and Agara landed P&G as your first client, which is very rare to land a Fortune 500 client company as your first client. Any thoughts on the 0 to 1 of sales? Did you build a product and then look for sales, or did you approach sales and product development hand in hand? What are your thoughts on that, Abhimanyu?
Yeah, so in our case, and this may not be the experience of other AI startups elsewhere, much of the product was developed sort of in consonance with the clients. And largely it was because the concept of what the final product should do was itself being defined. It's not like we had a very clear idea of what we want this to do at the end of the day, and we were building towards an objective. We were sort of defining this along and learning where the gaps are, where the problems are, and where did we need to sort of make compromises and not make compromises as well. And the approach sort of works brilliantly because unlike in a strict science, this is all about perceptions. This is about user experiences. Dr. Vinay talked about, engineers having to deal with ethical issues. We had to deal with some of our own where, we used to get calls from mothers who had recently lost their kids, and them calling up and talking about fairly sensitive things. And we had to take a call on whether machines should even bother to take some of these calls, or should we just simply, plug away and say, not this, not at all this. So some of those questions come up, and those are things that we only deal with when we get into the middle of it. And so helping sort of work this through on the floors along with the clients and all helped us deal with these sensitivities, situations that we otherwise could not have done in a lab environment.
I see. Very, very interesting insights. And your experience also on building a team on the sales has. How did you go about that as a company?
Right. So all the initial sales in these kinds of situations is almost evangelizations. It's
founder-led sales, you mean?
Exactly. It's you can't take a standard sales book and sort of go and start pitching something to people. You do need to take them along on this journey. You need to bring them up to a point where you are seeing things and so on. So initial sales in these situations is entirely founder-led because you have to sell that story. Even as we are expanding now and building up a fairly big team, both in India as well as in the US, we are looking at people who are not sort of hardcore hunters. We are looking at people who are storytellers, who can actually bring up our clients up to that level of understanding what you are getting out of it. And especially in an enterprise scenario, the scenario that we typically end up dealing with is the buyer of the product, the user of the product, and the person who's getting impacted by the product. These are all three different people.
I see.
We end up talking only to the buyer of the product, but we need to always consider the other two participants in this. So you need to be able to create that entire picture in front of us.
I see. Got it. Okay, great. Thanks for that, Abhimanyu. So next question to Dr. Geeta. You have made that transition from an AI researcher to an entrepreneur, right? Probably a lot of our audience would like to do that. How did you equip yourself to get better at fundraising and recruitment and business development and so on and so forth? It's an inspirational journey. What are your suggestions or advice to up-and-coming researchers who do want to take that entrepreneurial plunge?
Yeah, so maybe I'll start with the age-old proverb, right? Where there is a strong will, there the ways will open up, right? I guess that's what happened, when we decided to jump off. I didn't know. Honestly, I didn't know, we really have to do so many clinical trials to get to the sales. I mean, I just said this tech, whatever is working in the lab, should reach women, and we have to save lives. And that was the only sort of the tagline. And if I don't do it now, I'm not sure if somebody else is going to do it, and I'll regret when I die or just before I die, whatever, right? So that was what was running. So when you sort of, jump off with that and also have an open mind to learn every day, I think that's sort of you're passionate, you want to sort of, figure out the way, and sort of, you're in a wild jungle, you'll have an axe, you cut and go, right? You know roughly which direction you want to go. Having said that, you have to be sort of very willing to listen to feedback, and obviously not react to every feedback, but understand how to sort of consolidate. Typically what I do is, like, if I get the same feedback like twice or thrice, means that must be true. That's sort of one. So anyway, so that's one bit. And of course I did have some management sort of class from the Chicago wonderful masters, but then nothing like, learning on the job itself, roughly, right? So one is, of course, you get right kind of people around you, mentors, advisors, and of course, some senior leadership or co-founders, who can stay with you for a longer time, right? And so on and so forth, and who really deeply believe in the vision, and who bring in complementary skills, right? So that, of course, you feel like it's our child and all that, but you'll have to sort of give way and then say, okay, they're going to sort of also do this. And so that's one piece, to get leaders who have complementary skills and sort of move on and so on. And like Abhimanyu was saying, right, it's really the first few things are completely founder-led, right? You just go, you just sit in front of the doctors, and then the doctors actually see, the customers will actually see why you're doing it, the passion, whatever they call it, right? And they'll help you figure out, any gaps that are there in the product and so on. So it's really on the job, I would say. Sorry, it's not any major answer. Obviously, no books. One thing, of course, I did because of health tech, and some of the audience could be there, is obviously I just knew what was like breast cancer more from an end user standpoint, and seen that with some of the family members, but not really, know the terminology that you want to talk to the doctors. So I actually went and sat in very, very complex breast cancers conferences where, thousands of oncologists would come in, and most of the words would go, papers used to, and the words they use would go top of my head. But I used to make notes as to the terminologies, and then go back and do Wikipedia and Googles and so on and so forth, to actually learn those things, what those are, what are those matter, what is the latest. Of course, attended twice or thrice, you sort of get to understand them. So being with the domain and understanding some of the domain aspects of it is very, very critical, and you will have to do a conscious effort of doing that. Rest will fall in line as soon as you figure out you want to do it.
Yeah, I think your passion and tenacity shines through. So yeah, thanks for those insights. Dr. Zainul, maybe last question from my end before I open up to the panel is, now Tricog is sort of in an expansion phase, right? You're expanding across geographies as well as across product lines. Do you have any kind of like framework for deciding how do you do that expansion? And also a slightly related question is, how has your role of CTO changed probably in the past 5 years as you scale the company? Go ahead, please.
Okay, great question, Kiran. I think there's some magic behind that, and I think the magic is that you need to have business teams that are product focused and product teams that are business focused, right? Because I think geographic expansion and product expansion will not happen, and if you just do one and you don't have the product for that geography, or you have the products going on a different tangent, it just won't work. So I think that's I think the critical thing, and maybe it sounds a little bit obvious and maybe easy to do, but it actually isn't. And that's a constant struggle, and it's really, you have to build your leadership team along the way. And I think Dr. Charit, the CEO of Tricog, he's really done a great job at pulling a great team together, not just on the tech side, on the medical side. And of course on the business side, and really keeping everything, and the thing is that if you're transparent about this at the very top of the company, everything else flows and trickles down to every part of the company, and everybody is so really motivated to achieve the same milestones. I think that's a really key element to all of this, right? Just have very transparent communication. The other thing I have to add is that we have very strict financial discipline. And so, we set our own goals and we set our own constraints, and then we've got to show that we are actually staying within those constraints, even though we are leadership. Yes, we are Series B, and we are on a growth path. There's a mindset to really be very clear about where your spend is, and if you're going to go expansion in one place, you might have to change your plan in another place, right? And it's we call it the waterbed problem, right? You press it out on one side, it'll go the other side, right? So, but that's sort of the the attitude that we've gone through. On my side personally, I think it's been, as I said, about a 6-year journey. I've been somewhat of a generalist, all through my career. And I guess I've allowed myself to go into all kinds of different things. So I've taken on operations roles, I've taken on finance role, I take care of HR in the company as well. But I think that all of these things really is about, the essence of being an entrepreneur, right? You just, plug your fingers into the muck and, figure out what the temperature is and what the texture of the mud is. And then you build from there. I think it's just been a journey. I think everybody has their own unique journey. Good luck to all of you who are considering this. It's a fun place to be.
Yeah, I think whether you're a deep tech startup or a consumer tech startup, as you said, fiscal prudence is really important. And yeah, thanks for sharing your journey with us. And yeah, maybe I've asked enough questions. Why don't I let Arjun pick up some of the questions that our audience has been asking. Arjun, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Kiran, and amazing insights by all the panelists. Thank you, everyone. There's a lot of questions, bunch of questions coming in from the audience. Right, I'll pick up a few. First one, what are applications of AI in the waste management sector? Right, anybody on the panel want to take that and talk about how waste management can be impacted with interesting applications using AI?
We can probably take a short stab at it, but frankly, monetization and so on is a little difficult. One of the big areas we've been seeing, or rather we've seen it being used, is essentially in sorting, where if you remember a few years ago, China stopped taking all refuse. India has never really been, despite huge plans of doing waste to energy plans, we just never got around to it because our waste is too mixed up and so on. So one of the things now is happening in the US and some of the larger plants is using computer vision to quickly sort out different kinds of waste and so on. So we're seeing that happening at an operating level to help improve efficiency of the overall operation. We are yet to, at least in my opinion, knowledge, yet to see something that sort of comes out as a standalone thing to be able to do something about it.
Thank you, Abhimanyu. That's useful.
Can I just dot on the question and answer?
Please, Dr. Vinay.
Yeah, I think there was another question which spoke about areas where AI can be used or something like that. So I think I'll just combine these two questions. I think broadly, I think the first industrial revolution in some sense was about trying to see if we can replace physical labor of humans. And I think the AI revolution is really about, can we replace the cognitive portion of what humans do, or at least most of it. Okay? And I put up a slide about language, about speech, about vision, and so on. So I think even you just said about sorting waste and so on. It is really about vision. We can segregate based on some sort of vision based. So if anything falls into this category where you think that you can actually take on some cognitive task, then I think that would be your AI company. I think that's probably a simple test.
Just to add, I think, especially in the Indian context, right, optimizing of resources, right, the use of resources, making sure that the pick of man goes to every place, and how often do you have to go, and all of that sort of is something that if they want to solve a real on the ground problem, that's something that people can think about. But of course, the waste segregation is the sort of the most talked about in waste management.
Yeah, thank you very much. And we have another interesting question from one of our audience who says that the e-commerce companies in China, for example, and in US, they have all sort of aggregated, right, through M&As, etc. Do you see such opportunities in India as well? Big companies acquiring startups to aggregate, or startups themselves aggregating? Do you see that trend popping up going forward, especially in India? The big companies are good at generic tasks, acquiring narrow specific startups solving narrow specific use cases. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is sort of already happening, at least in my space. I can tell you, we've got Flipkart that's acquired a couple of AI companies in computer vision as well as language processing. Snapdeal acquired a company a long time ago on personalization of the pages across languages. We've got even traditional companies, the Birla Group and the Tata Group. Jio, of course, has built out an entire platform via acquisitions and so on. It's very much on. In fact, it's one of the things that's finally driving the first wave of exits that are happening from sort of somewhat AI-led companies which have started driving this. So we absolutely do see that happening, but we also, at least personally, I hope a slightly different outcome, which is Bangalore in particular has been driving a huge upsurge, probably larger than any other location in the world in terms of AI and SaaS startups coming out. So even with the wave of consolidation, I really hope that the base of this continues to be extremely disaggregated, the large number of startups trying out a lot of different things. We do need to have a lot of different people tackling different problems.
All right, thank you. I think there's a question for me where somebody has asked what AI how do you see difference between Indian AI startups and global AI startups? I'll say that Bangalore AI startups are Bangalore in general is the best weather-wise and otherwise, but I'm very biased because I'm originally from India. So Arjun, any other questions that you have for the panelists?
Yeah, I think question about key challenges during scale up, right, for AI businesses, right? Maybe a couple of the panelists that have gotten to certain scale, right, and are facing that right now or over the last couple of years. You can throw light on what changes after the first product market fit, right? What battles do you have to fight? That would be amazing to hear.
I can take a shot at this, Kiran. So there's there's two parts of that question, right? When you think about scale up, there's product scale up and business scale up. And let me talk about the AI side of the product scale up. The first, I guess, million or so ECGs that we got, and we are at close to about 5 million right now, were pretty good from the point of view of learning a model and all of that. And then we started realizing that as we got in more and more data, our models, had to get tuned and tweaked all the time, right? And so from a scale-up perspective, it actually you tend to realize where the biases in your system are, and how, as Professor said, you've got to identify those, and then you've got to weed them out. And the problem is that many of those are systematic decisions that you probably have taken a few years ago, right? And so you've got to really re-architect your product and think about how to do that, continuously. And that's a hard problem. And you've got to really think through some of those product decisions that you have made, especially anticipating some of these challenges that are going to come. On the business front, I think the challenges are what you would expect, in the sense that you've got to get into bigger other geographies, you've got to get into other business segments, you've got to get into other different use cases in the health tech space, especially because you've got regulatory that you have to tackle, and each country has their own regulatory sort of framework. You've got to be a little bit careful. Now, on top of that, because we are AI people and we are data people, we love our data, you also have to talk about patient privacy. You've got to talk about data protection. And, so those are the things that as you scale up, you want to sort of have, sort of one eye at the ground where you're walking, and then one eye in the distance on the kinds of problems that are going to prop up as you go along, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Geeta, this is a question to you from one of our audience members. How did you get acceptance from doctors of a new diagnostic product which is critical to your early success?
Yeah, so we continue to sort of do that every time you go to a more reputed doctor and say, I want to evaluate. sir, here are the clinical trials, because the first and foremost is a systematic clinical trial, right? Which is with a very, very systematized protocol and what is called as GCP, good clinical practice follow, and if possible, get an external CRO. So there is a level of unbiased, aspect that come in, as strict as if the sponsor, that which is a startup, goes to the hospital, they have to sign in a logbook where the hospital is doing the clinical trial. So, no influence from the sponsor, no financial, conflicts of interest with the principal investigator, all that type of thing. That's one. And when that is there, you actually aim to publish in top tier journals and conferences. I mean, focus on journals. As researchers, we generally do this is a different type of journal, which is more clinical trial oriented journals. So not sort of we continue to list what are those which are, the different in impact factors and so on, and how do we get there. So this is one continuous activity we've started doing, and it was actually a revelation. That it makes so much of a difference, right? Once we got an ASCO publication, it's like, doctor, oh, you have this, oh, let me read that. Okay, fine. I want to have a screening camp tomorrow, right? So the sales cycle, if you will, has come down quite a bit once we managed to get a top tier publication, which is a clinical trial. The next one, even though we have this, some of the doctors, obviously, they're making decisions based, almost based on our solution and test. So they want to basically, do another test. So we generally say, okay, there's a small evaluation period, and evaluation could be one camp, and we'll give that camp free. And after that, you decide, right? It's usually they're okay with it. And also another piece is, you can look at places where these kind of tests have never happened before, like villages and so on, where hand examination is what is actually the guideline, which is 25 millimeters cancer is all that you can detect. So we say, okay, alongside, let's do this. And when the doctors see the results, it's like proof is in the pudding. They basically, so there's no shortcut. You have to show clinical results, and only then the doctors, especially in these kinds of things. So it's very important, whoever is an entrepreneur, whether it's health tech or not, figure out which is the core problem you're addressing, the unique value prop from the deep tech that and then try and set up a testing framework or a validation framework, which everyone can believe the results, in. And you don't have to put all the paraphernalia, just very crisp as to, okay, a person takes our test followed by mammography, ultrasound, and biopsy, and there is an examination key answer check. That's as simple as it is, right? A completely blinded answers from the outside. So we have to be very clear about the protocol, and ask experts to make sure that there are no loopholes that people may suspect, in the protocol itself. And then there's no shortcut, especially for health tech. There's no shortcut.
Yeah, I think just touching upon this is an example, like one of the questions they asked was global AI startups and Indian AI startups. What are the difference? This, I think the panelists and the startups that we have today is an example where Silicon Valley and a couple of other startups are really good at solving for the top 1 billion. Probably Indian AI startups, here we have examples of people solving for the entire world, the top 1 billion as well as the bottom 6 billion. I think that is one key kind of example. Probably we have time for 2 more questions. Arjun, do you have any questions from our audience that you want to take?
I think there was one more question for Dr. Geeta, if she could, probably throw some light, because you particularly mentioned about proof of the pudding being in the results in clinical trials, right? Some results and, metrics that you can share that you're proud of, and, that is making doctors' jobs really, really much better. That will be great to share.
Sure, so I can share what's public and as well. So also when you actually formulate the results, right, you look at what is the target segment that we're addressing. So we are addressing the screening, like in the first test that everyone undergoes should be Nirmai test. And if it is positive, we don't put her to treatment, we actually send her to other diagnostic tests. So we kind of categorize the results as to asymptomatic people and symptomatic people. That is, people who do not have symptoms, obviously, with those who have symptoms. Those who have symptoms are called diagnostic part. So in the asymptomatic segment, I'm going to touch wood, we do have 100% sensitivity. We've fine-tuned in a way that also it is more sensitive than specific. Having said that, even in our blinded trial, we have not missed any cancer in asymptomatic women so far. And with a specificity of over 90%, which is something, we had to strive to that, to get to that. And also we have to be very clear as to which are the exclusions, right? If, for example, what are the play, and then the confidence scores, right? It's not like yes or no. We we can talk a lot about explainability and all of that, but basically we give one understanding of the report by any other doctor. So follow the same standards like people have followed before, but it's in a, like for example, BI-RAD is the scoring that's used for mammography. So we use what's called T-BI-RAD, thermal BI-RAD. So that is one. Different scales, right? 4 or 5 a cancer, like there's always an LO because never you can be like, so you give those results in a way. Anyway, so going back to the results, yes, we do have very good results on asymptomatic. Symptomatic, we say you can use alongside other tests, but still there also we have more than 92% sensitivity with about 80 plus specificity.
And probably, yeah, good. Maybe we have time for one last question, which is to Dr. Vinay. You gave such a fantastic presentation in the beginning. You've been in the ecosystem for so many decades. What is your read on the AI talent available in India? And also, more importantly, what can we do to produce high quality AI engineers, basic, applied, as well as researchers from India? Capital is one. Your final thoughts on that. Over to you.
I think AI requires, at least machine learning, as we know, requires a fair amount of mathematics. And it's a bit surprising because anybody who's gone to engineering knows that at the end of 4 years, they take up a job and they probably never look at mathematics again. And for some reason, AI models, probabilistic models, graphical models, all of these things require some maturity in mathematics. And I think that's one thing that we are lacking in our education. So maybe early exposure to AI, ML is possible, but I will not bet on that unless we actually do something to encourage students to take math a bit more seriously. And while I think we are at the same level, I think, as we were 20, 25 years back when the Y2K problem happened, I don't want to sound disparaging, but I think many people, we had become a visual basic country at that point in time. Okay, so if you know what I mean. And we are in the danger of becoming something similar. We would become a package-led AI country, which means that there are already packages available, maybe TensorFlow, maybe PyTorch, standard models that are available, and we'll just use these standard models. But if we have to tune a new architecture, then I have to understand something a bit more. And the West is doing a lot of that. And I don't see enough of that happening, primarily because we do not, as I said, we probably have less than 100 PhD students in the country, which is very, very small for a country of this scale. So something has to give, something has to change, I think. We do have talented people. I'm not saying we don't have talent, but I think it's very small for a country of our size. And not many of them are likely to go into entrepreneurship and so on. So those are the challenges.
Thanks for the words of caution, Professor Vinay, and thanks a lot to all of our panelists from the bottom of my heart. And Arjun, over to you to have the final words.
Thank you, Kiran, for hosting this wonderful discussion. To all the panelists for taking their valuable time and sharing their learnings. I'm sure it's been very valuable for all the entrepreneurs and the prospective entrepreneurs listening. It's very important. It's also inspiring, most importantly. Right, because we need more, just like Dr. Vinay said, we need more people coming into entrepreneurships with that mindset and with the right skill set to solve so many other problems that are out there in the ecosystem. So thanks once again to the panelists and to Kiran for moderating it wonderfully. Special thanks once again to Dr. Vinay for the keynote and the context setting background, as well as the future looking statements. Thank you once again for that lovely presentation.
Thanks.
Right. From all of us, thanks for spending the last 1.5 hours, right, from India Deep Tech. And just a reminder to all deep tech startups to please apply to the accelerator, right? And there is a link provided in the chat below, as well as will be on social media, right? And please reach out, right? There's a deadline on February 12th, asking everybody to apply, right? Thank you so much once again from India Deep Tech. Have a good evening, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Bye. Thanks.